Okay, next speech. Hunter Blackley. Ladies. I'm privileged to say this. I'm, as you know, English. I have no Scottish blood in me whatsoever. Thank God. I did attend a Burns night once in 1963 in the village of Fort William. Graham knows well, on a climbing holiday up there, and it was a wonderful evening, and the haggis was served, and at that time, that was before I was a vegetarian, I did eat the haggis. But, that was a really nice evening. But my job is to say a few words about the immortal memory of Robbie Burns. Robbie was born today in 1759 in Ayrshire, and died in 1796 at the tender age of 37 in poverty. Because people died much younger then. They weren't living in the Cliffs Valley, right? Robbie is known as the people's poet. He's widely regarded as the national poet of Scotland. He's considered by some, and they're mainly Scotsmen, as the world's greatest poet. Considered by some as not just a genius, but a genius who grew up on a farm. He's celebrated worldwide. Much of his writing is in the Scots language, which is what Graham attempted to do just now and did very well. Sometimes called Lowland Scots, but then much of his writing is actually in English with a Scots dialect. Burns was brought up on the farm, worked on the farm with his father, and at the age of 15, during the harvest, he was assisted by somebody called Nellie Kilpatrick. Oh. Obviously one of the Valley Kilpatricks. Nellie inspired his first poem. And I'm not going to attempt any of the Scottish nonsense here, right? Oh, once I had a bonny lass, and I love her still. And whilst that virtue warms my breast, I'll love my handsome Nell. This was not only the start of his poetry, it was the start of his relationship with many, many of the ladies. Robbie had many legitimate and more illegitimate children. As of 2012, Robbie has over 600 living descendants. Wow. He had 13 known children and probably up to 20 unknown children. Burns was having difficulty making a living on the farm, and he took up an offer to work on a slave plantation in Jamaica as a bookkeeper. He didn't have the money for the ship passage, so he decided that some of his poems he put in a volume. This was called Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. And in 1786, he was selling these on the street for 3 shillings a copy. And he did very well. His success was immediate. And soon he was known throughout the length and breadth of Scotland. This first verse is known as the Kilmarnock Volume. As he was taking his farewell of friends, packing his chest to go to Jamaica, he received a letter from one Thomas Blacklock. Thomas Blacklock was a blind poet. I don't know quite how he managed to write this, but he wrote a letter saying, Robbie, this work is really excellent, and you should stay here and write a much larger selection of your poems. And Robbie said, this fired me so much that I posted straight to that city, Edinburgh, without a single acquaintance and a single letter of introduction. And this letter, in fact, saved Burns' life, because the ship that he was booked package on to Jamaica sunk and lost all hands. So there's a situation. The first Edinburgh edition of poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect, was published in 1787. Within a week, he'd sold the copyright for 100 guineas. Big bucks. Burns's portrait was painted for this edition by Alexander Naismith. And you've probably all seen that picture because it appears on every box of Scotch shortbread that you buy. That's the only portrait that was ever done of Robbie Burns. Burns did very well in the city of Edinburgh. He was received as an equal by the city men of letters and was a guest at aristocratic gatherings. He made a lasting impression on Walter Scott, who later became Sir Walter Scott, who of course wrote Ivanhoe, Rob Roy, and became a very, very famous author. Walter Scott, when he was 16, when he met Burns, said, his person was strong and robust, his manners rustic, not clownish, a sort of dignified plainness and simplicity which received part of his effect, perhaps, from knowledge of his extraordinary talents, written by Walter Scott. This new edition of his poems brought Burns £400. Now, before I came up to see him, I thought, well, what on earth was £400 worth? £400 was worth approximately $500,000 in today's day. $500,000. So, with that, he became a very rich man. So he met many exciting people and he had many affairs with the ladies in Edinburgh. He was very much a radical and called himself a freedom fighter. At that time, the French Revolution was underway in Paris, and Burns was a big supporter of freedom for Scotland from the English aristocracy. In Edinburgh in early 1787, he met a music star, because he's not only known for his poems, he's known for his songs, of course, James Johnson. And he wrote many songs for the Scots musical collection. In 1788, he returned to Ayrshire and took a lease on a farm. Not a success, so he became an excise man, collecting monies for the Customs and Excise Department, riding around the towns on horseback, collecting money, and also writing poems and writing songs. He then moved to Dumfries and wrote many more songs, which are, this period was arguably his claim to immortality. For example, it was during this period he wrote Auld Lang Syne, and he wrote The Red, Red Rose, two very famous songs. The Red, Red Rose. Oh, my love's like a red, red rose that newly spring in June. Oh, my love's like the melody that sweetly plucked in tune. Please join me. As fair as thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. Robbie's health began to give up. He aged prematurely, and fell into fits of despondency. His death followed a dental extraction.
Oh my goodness.
For all those who've recently been to the dentist. 1795 at the age of 37. His influence in the United States was considerable. Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men is taken from Burns' poem To a Mouse, the best laid schemes of mice and men. Bob Dylan said, "A red, red rose," as a lyric that had the biggest effect on his life. And J.D. Salinger took Burns' Coming Through the Rye as the title of his novel that I expect we all read at high school, Catcher in the Rye. Burns also became the people's poet in Russia, where they related to his somewhat socialistic views. A translation of his poem in 1924 sold over 600,000 copies in Russia. And in 1956, the Soviets actually issued a stamp with Burns' portrait on it. As Graham said, and as I've said, Robbie was really fond of the ladies. However, he also was concerned about women's rights, which in those days I found quite interesting. This poem was directed at the goings-on in France and the French Revolution. While Europe's eye is fixed on mighty things, the fate of empires and the fall of kings, while quacks of state must each produce his plan, and even children amid this mighty fuss, yet let me mention the rights of women merit some attention. So he might have been the first there. In 2009, Scottish TV ran a TV public vote on who was the greatest Scot. Burns was voted the greatest Scot of all times. So, ladies and gentlemen, please stand. Raise your glasses to Robbie Burns, the people's poet, and perhaps the greatest Scotsman that ever lived.